The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as young Prince Louis, barely 5 years old, bounced down the grand hallway in his favorite dinosaur pajamas. His small feet made soft padding sounds against the polished stone, and his wild blonde hair stuck up at odd angles from sleep. The palace was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with most of the staff attending to their early duties in distant wings of the massive residence. Louis had woken up with a scratchy throat and a stuffy nose, the kind that made his voice sound funny when he tried to talk. He had called for his father, Prince William, but was told that Papa had already left for his morning engagements. His mother, Catherine, was away on a 3-day royal tour in Scotland, something that had been planned for months but now felt terribly inconvenient to the little prince who just wanted comfort. The boy wandered into the breakfast room, where the morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny fairies. He climbed onto his usual chair, the one with the special booster seat that made him feel grown-up, and waited for someone to notice he needed help. His throat hurt when he swallowed, and he kept sniffling, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his pajamas in a way that would have made his nanny, Maria, gently scold him. It was then that Camilla, the queen consort, entered the breakfast room with purposeful steps. She was already dressed for the day in a cream-colored suit with pearl earrings, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She had heard about Louis's slight illness from the night staff and had taken it upon herself to ensure the child received proper care. In her experience, children's minor ailments could quickly become major inconveniences if not addressed immediately and firmly. "Good morning, Louis," she said in her crisp voice, settling into the chair across from him. "I understand you're feeling unwell today." Louis looked up at her with watery blue eyes and nodded, not quite sure why Camilla was here instead of his usual caregivers. He was used to seeing her at formal family gatherings and holiday celebrations, but having breakfast alone with her felt strange and somewhat intimidating. She had always been kind to him, but there was something different about her presence this morning, something more serious and businesslike than he was accustomed to. "Yes, my throat hurts," he managed to say in his small voice, which came out as more of a croak. Camilla nodded efficiently and reached into her handbag, pulling out a small glass bottle filled with dark brown liquid. The bottle was old-fashioned, the kind that might have been used decades ago, with a corkstopper and a faded label that Louis couldn't read from where he sat. The liquid inside looked thick and unpleasant, like something that belonged in a witch's potion rather than a medicine cabinet. "This is a very special remedy," Camilla explained, unscrewing the cork with a small pop that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "It's been in my family for generations. My grandmother used it, my mother used it, and I've used it on Charles when he was feeling poorly. It works much better than those modern medicines with all their artificial ingredients and preservatives." The smell that emerged from the bottle was overwhelming and medicinal, with hints of herbs and something earthy that made Louis's already queasy stomach turn slightly. It reminded him of the smell in old churches or the dusty corners of antique shops, mixed with something bitter and sharp that made his eyes water even more than they already were. Louis wrinkled his small nose and leaned back in his chair instinctively. "It smells funny, Grandmama Camilla," he said, using the name his parents had taught him to call her, though it still felt awkward on his tongue. "Many of the best medicines smell and taste unpleasant," Camilla replied matter-of-factly, pouring a generous spoonful of the dark liquid onto a silver teaspoon that she had brought with her. "That's how you know they're working. The worse it tastes, the more effective it is at fighting off whatever is making you feel sick." The spoon seemed enormous to Louis as Camilla held it toward him, filled to the brim with the mysterious brown liquid. A small drop had formed at the tip of the spoon and threatened to fall onto the pristine white tablecloth below. The child's instinct was to pull away from anything that smelled so strongly and looked so unappetizing, especially when he was already feeling unwell. "I don't want to," Louis said quietly, pressing his lips together and leaning further back in his chair. His small hands gripped the arms of his chair as if anchoring himself against what was to come. Camilla's expression grew more stern, though she maintained the patient tone that adults often used when trying to convince children to do things they didn't want to do. "Now, Louis, you know that sometimes we must do things we don't enjoy in order to feel better. This medicine will have you running around and playing by this afternoon, but only if you take it now." She moved the spoon closer to his mouth, and Louis could smell the bitter herbs even more strongly. There was something in the mixture that reminded him of the time he had accidentally tasted dirt while playing in the garden, mixed with the sharp smell of the cleaning supplies the housekeeping staff used in the bathrooms. His stomach churned, and he felt even more miserable than when he had first woken up. "Please, I don't want it," Louis repeated, this time with more urgency in his voice. He turned his head to the side, trying to avoid the approaching spoon, but Camilla was persistent. "Louis, you're being silly," she said, though there was a slight edge to her patience now. "It's just one spoonful, and then it will be over. Open your mouth like a good boy." But Louis had made up his mind that nothing could convince him to swallow whatever was in that spoon. He pressed his lips together even more tightly and shook his head, his blonde hair flying back and forth with the motion. Tears began to form in his eyes, partly from feeling sick and partly from the overwhelming smell and the pressure he felt to do something he absolutely didn't want to do. Camilla sighed and set the spoon down on the table with a small clink that seemed louder than it should have in the tense silence of the room. She reached across the table and, gently but firmly grasped Louis's chin between her thumb and forefinger, tilting his face toward her so he couldn't turn away. "Louis Edward Anthony Louis," she said, using his full formal name in the way that adults did when they meant business, "you will take this medicine right now. I am not going to sit here all morning arguing with a child about something that is clearly for your own good." The use of his full name sent a chill through Louis's small body. He had heard that tone before from his parents when he had done something particularly naughty, and he knew it meant that the adult's patience was running out. But even the threat in her voice couldn't overcome his instinctive revulsion to whatever was in that spoon. With her free hand, Camilla picked up the spoon again, now holding Louis's face steady so he couldn't move away. The dark liquid swirled slightly in the bowl of the spoon, and Louis could see small particles floating in it that looked like tiny pieces of herbs or bark. The smell was so strong now that it made his eyes water and his throat close up even more than it already had from his cold. "Open your mouth, Louis," Camilla commanded, bringing the spoon closer to his tightly sealed lips. "I'm going to count to 3, and if you haven't opened your mouth by then, I'm going to be very disappointed in you." Louis whimpered but kept his mouth firmly shut, even as Camilla began to count in her stern voice. 1. The spoon moved closer. 2. Louis could feel the cool metal of the spoon touching his lower lip, and the smell was so overwhelming that he thought he might be sick. 3. When Louis still refused to open his mouth, Camilla's patience finally snapped completely. She pressed the spoon harder against his lips, trying to force them apart, while maintaining her grip on his chin. "Louis, you are being absolutely ridiculous. This is for your own good, and I will not allow a child to defy me when I am trying to help him." The little prince began to cry in earnest now, tears streaming down his cheeks as he struggled against Camilla's grip. He tried to turn his head, but her hold on his chin was too firm. He tried to push the spoon away with his hands, but Camilla was much stronger than he was. The dark liquid sloshed dangerously in the spoon, threatening to spill all over him and the table. It was at this exact moment that Sergeant James Mitchell, one of the personal protection officers assigned to the young royals, entered the breakfast room to conduct his routine morning security check. He had been working royal protection for 8 years, ever since leaving the British Army, and he had seen many things in his career. But nothing had prepared him for the scene that greeted him that morning. James was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of military training and constant physical preparation for any threat that might arise. His dark hair was cut in the precise military style that he had maintained even after leaving active duty, and his brown eyes missed nothing as they swept any room he entered. He wore the standard dark suit that all protection officers favored, cut to conceal the various tools of his trade while allowing for quick movement if necessary. He had been approaching the breakfast room when he heard the sound of crying, which immediately put him on alert. Any distress involving the royal children was his business, and he quickened his pace down the hallway, his hand instinctively moving toward the radio on his belt in case backup was needed. What he saw when he rounded the corner into the breakfast room made him stop short. Prince Louis, clearly upset and struggling, was being held firmly by Camilla while she attempted to force a spoon of some unknown substance into his mouth. The child's tears and obvious distress triggered every protective instinct that James possessed, both as a trained security officer and as a father of 2 young children himself. Ma'am, James said in his calm but authoritative voice, stepping into the room with the confident bearing that came from years of handling delicate situations. Is everything all right here? Camilla looked up sharply, clearly startled by his sudden appearance and not pleased at being interrupted in what she considered a private family matter. She still held Louis's chin in her grip, and the spoon remained poised near his mouth, though she had stopped trying to force it past his lips when James entered the room. Sergeant Mitchell, she said with the tone of someone who was not accustomed to being questioned about her actions, particularly by staff members. This is simply a family matter. Prince Louis is unwell, and I am administering some medicine to help him feel better. James's trained eyes took in the scene quickly and thoroughly. He noted the child's obvious distress, the tears streaming down his face, the way his small body was rigid with fear and resistance. He saw Camilla's firm grip on the boy's face and the large spoon filled with dark liquid that looked nothing like any children's medicine he had ever seen. His protective instincts, honed by years of military service and royal protection duty, told him that something was very wrong with this situation. I can see that Prince Louis appears to be quite distressed, ma'am, James said carefully, maintaining the respectful tone that protocol demanded while making it clear that he was not going to simply walk away. Perhaps there's another approach that might be less upsetting for him? Louis, hearing a friendly adult voice and seeing someone who might help him, began to cry even harder and tried to reach toward James with his small arms. I don't want to take it, he managed to sob between tears. It smells bad and I don't want it. Camilla's grip on his chin tightened slightly, and she gave James a look that was clearly meant to dismiss him from the room. Sergeant Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but this is not a security matter. This is simply a case of a child being stubborn about taking medicine that will help him feel better. I have raised children before, and I know what I'm doing. But James had seen enough in his career to recognize the difference between normal childhood resistance to medicine and genuine distress. The scene before him crossed lines that his training and his conscience would not allow him to ignore. Prince Louis was clearly terrified, and whatever was in that spoon was not any kind of children's medicine that James had ever encountered. Ma'am, with respect, James said, taking a step closer to the table, I think Prince Louis has made it quite clear that he doesn't want to take whatever that is. Perhaps we should respect his wishes and contact his physician instead? The suggestion that she should seek a second opinion about how to care for Louis clearly angered Camilla, who was not used to having her decisions questioned, particularly by someone she considered to be staff. Her voice took on a sharper edge as she responded, Sergeant Mitchell, you are overstepping your bounds here. I am perfectly capable of caring for this child, and I do not need your input on family matters. James could see that the situation was escalating, and his primary concern was the well-being of the child who was still crying and struggling in Camilla's grip. He made a decision that would have consequences far beyond that morning, but which felt absolutely necessary in that moment. Ma'am, he said in the firm voice he had used as a sergeant in the army when lives depended on his orders being followed, I'm going to have to ask you to put down that spoon and release Prince Louis. He is clearly in distress, and I cannot allow that to continue. The breakfast room fell into a tense silence broken only by Louis's quiet sobs and the sound of birds chirping outside the tall windows. Camilla stared at James with a mixture of shock and outrage, clearly unable to believe that a member of the security staff was actually challenging her authority over a family matter. You cannot be serious, she said, her voice rising slightly. Are you actually suggesting that you have the authority to tell me how to care for this child? James stood his ground, his military training evident in his straight posture and steady gaze. Ma'am, my job is to protect the members of the royal family from all threats to their safety and well-being. Right now, I believe Prince Louis is in distress, and it is my responsibility to address that. The standoff continued for several long moments, with Camilla clearly weighing her options and James prepared to take whatever action necessary to protect the child in his care. Louis continued to cry softly, still trapped between them and not understanding the full implications of what was happening around him. It was in this charged atmosphere that the morning took a turn that no one could have anticipated, setting in motion events that would ripple through the royal household and beyond in ways that none of them could have imagined when the day began with such ordinary concerns about a child's runny nose and sore throat. The ancient clock in the corner of the breakfast room chimed 9 times, marking an hour that would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when ordinary family dynamics collided with duty, protocol, and the fierce protective instincts that guide those sworn to guard the most vulnerable members of the royal family. Outside the windows, the morning sun continued to shine on the palace gardens, completely indifferent to the human drama unfolding in the elegant breakfast room where a simple spoonful of medicine had become the catalyst for something much larger and more complex than anyone could have anticipated. The tension in the breakfast room had reached a breaking point that seemed to suspend time itself. Louis's quiet sobs filled the silence between the two adults locked in their standoff, while outside the palace walls, life continued normally, unaware of the drama unfolding within. James stood firm, his years of military and protection training telling him that he was witnessing something that went beyond normal discipline or medicine administration. Camilla's face had flushed with anger and embarrassment at being challenged by someone she considered to be merely staff. Her grip on Louis's chin remained firm, though she had momentarily lowered the spoon while dealing with James's interference. The dark liquid in the spoon had begun to congeal slightly around the edges, making it look even more unappetizing than before. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position, "I am going to say this one final time. You are completely out of line here. This child is family, and I am perfectly capable of determining what is best for his health. Your job is to protect us from external threats, not to interfere in private family matters." James felt the weight of his position and the delicate nature of the situation, but his instincts as both a protector and a father would not allow him to back down. He could see that Louis was not just being stubborn about medicine, the child was genuinely frightened and overwhelmed by whatever Camilla was trying to make him swallow. "Ma'am," James replied, maintaining his respectful tone while standing his ground, "I understand your position, but Prince Louis is clearly distressed, and I have concerns about what you're trying to give him. Perhaps we could contact his regular physician, Dr. Harrison, to confirm that this medicine is appropriate for a child his age?" The mention of Dr. Harrison, the family's longtime pediatrician, seemed to irritate Camilla even further. She had always felt that modern doctors were too cautious, too willing to coddle children instead of giving them what they needed to build strong constitutions. Her own childhood had been filled with bitter medicines and tough remedies that had served her well throughout her life. Dr. Harrison knows nothing about traditional remedies, she snapped. "This medicine has been used in my family for generations. It cured my father's chest infections, my brother's childhood ailments, and it helped Charles through numerous illnesses over the years. It is far more effective than anything you'll find in a modern pharmacy." Louis, still crying and trying to pull away from her grip, looked desperately at James with eyes that pleaded for rescue. The child didn't understand all the adult conversation happening around him, but he could sense that James was trying to help him, and that gave him a small spark of hope in what had become a terrifying morning. James took a careful step closer to the table, his movements slow and non-threatening but purposeful. "Ma'am, I'm sure your family remedy has helped many people over the years, but Prince Louis has made it very clear that he doesn't want to take it. Perhaps we could find an alternative that he might be more comfortable with?" But Camilla had reached the end of her patience with what she saw as insubordination from a staff member who had no business interfering in family business. She turned back to Louis, still holding his chin firmly, and brought the spoon back up toward his mouth with renewed determination. "Louis," she said in a voice that brooked no argument, "you are going to take this medicine right now. I have been more than patient with your behavior, but this nonsense has gone on long enough." She pressed the spoon against his closed lips with more force than before, trying to push the bitter liquid past his resistance. Some of the dark medicine spilled over the edge of the spoon and ran down Louis's chin, staining his dinosaur pajamas and filling his nostrils with its overwhelming herbal smell. Louis began to struggle more frantically, pushing against Camilla's hand with his small arms while trying to turn his head away from the advancing spoon. His sobs became more urgent, and he began to make choking sounds as the smell and taste of the spilled medicine made him gag. It was at this precise moment that James's military training and paternal instincts converged into decisive action. He could see that the situation had moved beyond simple resistance to medicine and into what he perceived as a genuine threat to the child's well-being. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and, firmly but respectfully placed his hand on Camilla's wrist, stopping the spoon just inches from Louis's mouth. Ma'am, I cannot allow this to continue, he said in the authoritative voice he had used countless times when lives depended on immediate action. I am asking you to please put the spoon down and step away from Prince Louis. The physical contact broke the last barrier of protocol and propriety. Camilla stared at James in absolute shock and outrage, unable to believe that he had actually put his hands on her to prevent her from carrying out what she saw as necessary medical care for the child. Remove your hand from me immediately, she commanded, her voice rising to a level that echoed off the marble walls of the breakfast room. How dare you lay hands on me? I am the queen consort, and you are completely out of line. But James did not remove his hand. Instead, he gently but firmly guided her wrist away from Louis's face, causing her to release her grip on the child's chin. Louis immediately slumped back in his chair, tears streaming down his face but relief evident in his small body as he was finally free from the restraint. Ma'am, James said calmly, though his heart was pounding with the knowledge that he had just crossed a line that might cost him his career, I am sworn to protect Prince Louis from all threats to his safety and well-being. I believe that forcing him to take an unknown substance against his will constitutes such a threat. Camilla jerked her wrist free from his gentle grip, the spoon clattering to the floor and spilling its dark contents across the pristine marble in an ugly stain that seemed to symbolize how badly the morning had gone wrong. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made Louis flinch. This is absolutely outrageous, she exclaimed, her composure completely shattered. You have physically assaulted the queen consort to prevent me from giving medicine to a sick child. This is beyond anything I could have imagined from someone in your position. James remained calm, though he was acutely aware that his actions would have far-reaching consequences. Ma'am, I touched your wrist to prevent what I perceived as a threat to Prince Louis. I used only the minimum force necessary to protect him, and I meant no disrespect to your person or position. Louis had stopped crying and was now watching the adults with wide, confused eyes. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he could sense that James had helped him avoid something he desperately didn't want to do. The relief of not having to swallow the terrible-smelling medicine was overwhelming, but he was also frightened by the angry voices and the tension in the room. Camilla began pacing back and forth behind her chair, her hands shaking with anger and her face flushed red. You have no idea what you've done here, Sergeant Mitchell. No idea at all. You cannot simply decide that you know better than family members about what is best for these children. That is not your job, and it is certainly not your right. Ma'am, James replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around him, my job is to protect the royal family from all threats. When I see a child in distress, being forced to consume an unknown substance against his will, I have to act. That is exactly what my training and my oath require me to do. The mention of his oath seemed to infuriate Camilla even more. Your oath? Your oath is to obey the orders of your superiors and to protect us from criminals and terrorists, not to interfere when family members are caring for sick children. You have completely misunderstood your role here. James knew that she had a point about the unprecedented nature of his actions. In all his years of royal protection, he had never before intervened in what could be considered a family matter. But something about the scene he had witnessed, the child's obvious terror, the mysterious medicine, the physical force being used, had triggered every alarm in his professional and personal judgment. Ma'am, perhaps we could resolve this by having Dr. Harrison examine Prince Louis and determine what medicine would be most appropriate for his symptoms, he suggested, hoping to find a middle ground that might defuse the situation. But Camilla was beyond compromise at this point. She felt that her authority had been completely undermined in front of Louis, and she could not let such a challenge pass without consequences. There will be no discussion of compromise, Sergeant Mitchell. You have overstepped your bounds in the most serious way possible, and there will be consequences for your actions. She turned to Louis, who was still sitting in his chair looking small and frightened. Louis, I want you to understand that Sergeant Mitchell prevented you from taking medicine that would have made you feel much better. His actions were completely inappropriate, and they were not in your best interests. Louis looked between the two adults, not really understanding the complex dynamics at play but sensing that something important had happened. I didn't want to take it, he said quietly, his voice still rough from crying. It smelled bad, and it made me scared. Children are often scared of things that are good for them, Camilla replied, though her tone toward Louis was gentler than it had been toward James. That's why adults sometimes have to make difficult decisions on their behalf. But, Sergeant Mitchell has made it impossible for me to help you get better quickly. James felt a surge of protective anger at the way Camilla was trying to make Louis feel guilty for not wanting to take her mystery medicine, but he forced himself to remain professional. Prince Louis, you should never have to take any medicine that makes you feel scared or uncomfortable. There are many different medicines available, and we can find one that will help you feel better without frightening you. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the breakfast room interrupted their conversation. All three of them turned toward the door as Maria, Louis's primary nanny, appeared in the doorway. She had been looking for Louis to help him get dressed for the day and had followed the sound of raised voices. Maria was a middle-aged woman from Spain who had been with the family for 3 years. She had a warm, maternal presence that immediately calmed children, and she was known for her gentle but effective approach to childcare. She took one look at the scene, Louis's tear-stained face, the dark stain on the floor, the tension between the adults, and immediately understood that something serious had occurred. "Good morning, everyone," she said carefully, her slight Spanish accent making her words sound especially warm after the harsh exchange between James and Camilla. "Is everything all right here?" I heard voices. Camilla seized on Maria's arrival as an opportunity to reassert her authority and gain support for her version of events. "Maria, thank goodness you're here. I was trying to give Louis some medicine for his cold, but Sergeant Mitchell physically prevented me from doing so. He actually grabbed my wrist and forced me to stop caring for a sick child." Maria's eyes widened as she took in this information, her gaze moving between Camilla's flushed, angry face and James's calm but clearly tense demeanor. She had worked with enough families to recognize when adult conflicts had spiraled beyond reasonable bounds, and she was primarily concerned about the impact on Louis. "I see," she said diplomatically, moving toward Louis's chair. "And how are you feeling this morning, my little prince? Are you still not feeling well?" Louis nodded, sniffling slightly. "My throat hurts, and, Maria, Grandmama Camilla wanted me to take medicine that smelled really bad. I didn't want to take it, but she tried to make me, and then Sergeant James helped me." Maria knelt down beside Louis's chair so she could look at him at eye level, her trained caregiver's instincts taking over. She placed a gentle hand on his forehead to check for fever and looked carefully at his face to assess his condition. "Let me see your throat, sweetheart," she said softly. Louis opened his mouth obligingly, and Maria could see that his throat was indeed slightly red and irritated. "Yes, I can see that you're not feeling your best today. But don't worry, we'll find some nice medicine that will help you feel better without tasting bad or smelling strange." Her words were clearly directed at reassuring Louis, but they also carried an implicit criticism of Camilla's approach that did not go unnoticed. Camilla's face grew even redder as she realized that yet another member of the household staff was questioning her judgment. "Maria," Camilla said sharply, "I would appreciate it if you would not undermine the medical decisions that I make for these children. The remedy I was giving Louis is a traditional medicine that has been used successfully for generations." Maria stood up slowly, her professional demeanor intact but her protective instincts for Louis clearly engaged. "Of course, Your Majesty. I would never presume to question your judgment. However, perhaps we could also consult with Dr. Harrison about the best approach for treating Louis's symptoms? He knows the child's medical history very well." The suggestion of calling the doctor was now coming from 2 different staff members, which only served to increase Camilla's sense that she was being ganged up on by people who didn't understand the value of traditional remedies and strong parenting approaches. "I am perfectly capable of determining what is best for this child without consulting every available medical professional," she said icily. "The problem here is not my medical knowledge, it is the complete breakdown of proper respect and hierarchy in this household." She turned her attention back to James, her anger having had time to build during the conversation with Maria. "Sergeant Mitchell, you have created a situation that goes far beyond your authority and training. Your actions this morning will be reported to your superiors, and I expect there will be serious consequences for your behavior." James nodded acknowledgement of her statement, though his posture remained firm and professional. "Ma'am, I understand that you're upset, and I accept that there will likely be consequences for my actions. However, I want to be clear that I would make the same decision again under the same circumstances. My primary responsibility is the safety and well-being of the royal family, particularly the children. Your primary responsibility, Camilla shot back, is to follow orders and show proper respect to the family members you serve. You have failed completely in both of those areas this morning. Maria, sensing that the conflict between the adults was escalating again and concerned about the impact on Louis, gently intervened. Perhaps we could continue this discussion later, after we've taken care of Louis's immediate needs? He's still not feeling well, and all this upset isn't helping him recover. She was right that the conflict was clearly distressing Louis, who had begun to look overwhelmed again as the adults continued their heated exchange. The child didn't fully understand what they were arguing about, but he could sense the anger and tension, and it was making him feel worse rather than better. Camilla realized that Maria had a point about not continuing the argument in front of Louis, but she was not ready to let James's actions pass without making her position absolutely clear. You're right that Louis doesn't need to witness any more of this conflict. However, I want everyone to understand that what happened here this morning represents a serious breach of protocol that will have lasting consequences. She gathered up her handbag and the now empty medicine bottle, her movements sharpened, angry. Louis, I hope you understand that the adults who care about you sometimes have to make decisions that might not seem pleasant at the time but are necessary for your health and well-being. With that, she swept out of the breakfast room, leaving behind a trail of tension and the dark stain on the marble floor where the spilled medicine had already begun to dry into an ugly mark that would require special cleaning to remove. James, Maria, and Louis sat in the aftermath of the storm, each processing what had just occurred in their own way. The morning that had begun with such ordinary concerns about a child's cold had transformed into something much more significant, with implications that none of them could fully foresee. Maria was the first to break the silence, her voice gentle and reassuring as she addressed Louis. Well, my little prince, that was quite an exciting morning, wasn't it? But don't worry, we're going to take very good care of you and help you feel better in no time. Louis nodded, still looking uncertain about everything that had happened. Maria, was Sergeant James in trouble for helping me? It was a question that cut right to the heart of the moral complexity of the situation, and Maria found herself struggling to find an age-appropriate answer that would be both honest and reassuring to the child. Maria looked down at Louis's worried face and felt her heart break a little at the confusion and concern in his young eyes. She had worked with enough families to understand that children often blamed themselves when adults around them were in conflict, and she needed to make sure Louis didn't carry that burden. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly, sitting down in the chair that Camilla had vacated so she could be closer to his eye level. Sergeant James was trying to help you because he could see that you were upset and scared. Sometimes adults have to make very difficult decisions about what's right, and different adults might see the same situation in different ways. Louis wiped his nose on his pajama sleeve again, a gesture that was becoming habitual this morning. But Grandmama Camilla was angry at him. Does that mean he did something wrong? It was exactly the kind of complex moral question that Maria had been hoping to avoid, but Louis's direct approach to the situation left her little choice but to address it honestly, in terms he could understand. Well, she said carefully, I think Sergeant James saw that you were very frightened, and he wanted to help you feel safe. That's a good thing. But Grandmama Camilla was trying to help you feel better from your cold, which is also a good thing. Sometimes when two people are both trying to help, they might not agree on the best way to do it. James, who had been standing quietly near the window while Maria spoke with Louis, felt a mixture of gratitude for her diplomatic handling of the situation and anxiety about what would happen next. He knew that Camilla would follow through on her threat to report his actions, and he was genuinely uncertain about whether his superiors would support his decision to intervene. Maria, he said quietly, I should probably contact my supervisor and let them know what happened here this morning. They'll want to hear about it from me before they hear it from anyone else. Maria nodded, understanding the political realities of working within the royal household. That's probably wise, James. And I should probably call Dr. Harrison to come look at Louis and determine the best treatment for his cold. The mention of the doctor seemed to cheer Louis up considerably. Dr. Harrison had been treating the royal children since Louis was a baby, and the boy was comfortable with him in a way that he clearly hadn't been with Camilla's mysterious remedy.
"Will Dr. Harrison give me medicine that doesn't smell bad?" Louis asked hopefully.
"I'm sure he will," Maria replied with a warm smile. "Dr. Harrison has lots of different medicines, and many of them taste like cherry or strawberry. He always tries to find something that won't be scary for children." James felt a surge of vindication hearing this exchange. If there were child-friendly alternatives available, then there had been no need to force Louis to endure whatever unpleasant concoction Camilla had been trying to give him. His protective instincts had been correct, even if his methods had been unprecedented. "I should go make those phone calls," he said, but before he could leave the breakfast room, the sound of rapid footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of another person. Inspector David Thompson, the senior protection officer on duty that morning, appeared in the doorway with the slightly breathless look of someone who had been urgently summoned. David was in his early 40s, with graying temples and the kind of steady demeanor that came from 20 years in law enforcement before joining the Royal Protection Detail. He was James's direct supervisor and had always been supportive of his team, but the expression on his face suggested that he was dealing with something unprecedented. "James," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also a note of concern, "I need to speak with you immediately. We've received a complaint about an incident involving the Queen Consort, and I need to understand exactly what happened here." The formal tone and the use of his first name rather than his rank told James everything he needed to know about how serious the situation had become. Camilla had clearly wasted no time in making her complaint official, and now he would have to account for his actions to the people who held his career in their hands. "Of course, sir," James replied, straightening into the formal posture that his military training had ingrained in him. "I was actually about to contact you to report the incident myself." David's expression softened slightly at this. In his experience, officers who were preparing to report their own questionable actions were usually those who believed they had acted correctly, even if their methods might be subject to scrutiny. "Good," he said. "Maria, I'm sorry to interrupt your morning, but would it be possible for you to take Prince Louis somewhere else while James and I discuss this situation? I think it would be better if he didn't have to listen to the details of what happened." Maria immediately stood up and extended her hand to Louis. "Of course. Come along, little prince. Let's go get you dressed for the day, and then we can call Dr. Harrison to come check on your throat." Louis took her hand but looked back at James with worried eyes. "Sergeant James, are you going to be in big trouble?" The innocent question hit both men harder than any official reprimand could have. David looked at James with raised eyebrows, clearly beginning to understand that whatever had happened, it had involved protecting Louis from something that the child had found distressing. "I'll be fine, Prince Louis," James said with more confidence than he felt. "You just focus on feeling better, okay?" Louis nodded and allowed Maria to lead him out of the breakfast room, but not before taking one more look at the dark stain on the marble floor where the spilled medicine had left its mark. The physical evidence of the morning's conflict would be cleaned away by the housekeeping staff within hours, but the emotional and professional consequences were just beginning. Once they were alone, David closed the door to the breakfast room and turned to face James with the expression of a man preparing to deal with a situation he had never encountered in his career. "James," he said, settling into one of the breakfast chairs, "I've just spent 10 minutes listening to the Queen Consort describe an incident in which you allegedly physically restrained her to prevent her from giving medicine to Prince Louis. Please tell me there's more to this story than that." James took a deep breath, knowing that his career and reputation were about to be decided by how well he could explain and justify his actions. "Sir, there is definitely more to it than that. When I entered this room approximately 30 minutes ago, I found Prince Louis in obvious distress, crying and trying to pull away from the Queen Consort, who was holding his chin and attempting to force him to swallow something from a spoon." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Describe exactly what you observed, James. Leave nothing out." "Prince Louis was clearly frightened and upset, sir. He was crying and saying that he didn't want to take whatever was being offered. The Queen Consort had a firm grip on his chin to prevent him from turning away, and she was pressing a spoon filled with some kind of dark liquid against his closed lips, trying to force them open." James paused to organize his thoughts, knowing that the details mattered enormously in a situation like this.
The substance in the spoon didn't look like any children's medicine I've ever seen. It was dark brown, thick, and had a very strong herbal smell that seemed to be making Prince Louis feel worse rather than better. Some of it had spilled onto his face and pajamas, and he appeared to be gagging from the smell. David nodded, encouraging him to continue. What did you do initially when you observed this? I first tried to de-escalate the situation verbally, sir. I asked if everything was all right and suggested that perhaps Dr. Harrison could be consulted about appropriate medicine for Prince Louis's cold symptoms. The Queen Consort told me that this was a family matter and that I should not interfere. But you did interfere, David pointed out, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. Yes, sir, I did. When it became clear that Prince Louis was genuinely distressed and that the Queen Consort was prepared to use physical force to make him swallow this unknown substance, I made the decision that his well-being was at risk. James straightened his shoulders, knowing that this was the moment when his justification would either save his career or end it. Sir, I placed my hand on the Queen Consort's wrist to prevent her from continuing to force the spoon toward Prince Louis's mouth. I used only the minimum force necessary to stop the action, and I released her as soon as she stepped away from the child. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and weighing it against his own experience with royal protocol and protection procedures. James, you understand that what you've described is an unprecedented breach of protocol? You physically restrained a senior member of the royal family to prevent her from carrying out what she considered to be appropriate medical care for a child. Yes, sir, I understand the severity of my actions from a protocol standpoint, James replied. But I also understand my oath to protect the members of the royal family from all threats to their safety and well-being. In that moment, I believed that Prince Louis was being subjected to treatment that was causing him genuine distress and possible harm. David rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with the competing demands of protocol, duty, and practical reality. James, help me understand something. In your assessment, was this a case of normal childhood resistance to taking medicine, or something more serious? Sir, I have 2 children of my own, ages 6 and 8. I've dealt with plenty of resistance to taking medicine. This was different. Prince Louis wasn't just being stubborn, he was genuinely terrified. The substance the Queen Consort was trying to give him looked and smelled like nothing I've ever seen used for children's medicine, and his physical reaction suggested it might have been making him feel worse rather than better. The mention of James's own children seemed to resonate with David, who also had experience as a father. Did you get a good look at this supposed medicine? Yes, sir. It was in an old-fashioned glass bottle with a cork stopper, filled with dark brown liquid that had a very strong herbal smell. It looked more like something you might find in a Victorian apothecary than in a modern medicine cabinet. The Queen Consort mentioned that it was a traditional family remedy that had been used for generations. David made a note on his pad, his expression thoughtful. And what was Prince Louis's condition when you left the room? Much calmer, sir. Once he was no longer being restrained and forced to take the medicine, his distress decreased significantly. Maria arrived shortly after the incident and took charge of his care. She mentioned calling Dr. Harrison to examine him and determine appropriate treatment. The door to the breakfast room opened quietly, and one of the housekeeping staff peered in hesitantly. Excuse me, sirs, but should we clean up the spill on the floor? David looked at the dark stain where the medicine had been spilled and made a quick decision. Not yet. I want to have it photographed first, and I'd like to have a sample analyzed if possible. The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, leaving the 2 men alone again. James felt a small surge of hope at David's decision to preserve the evidence. It suggested that his supervisor was taking his concerns seriously rather than simply viewing this as a case of insubordination. James, David said after a moment, I want you to understand something. Even if your concerns about Prince Louis's well-being were completely justified, the way you handled this situation has created enormous problems. The Queen Consort is understandably outraged that a protection officer would physically restrain her, regardless of the circumstances. I understand that, sir, James replied. But I want to be clear that if I were faced with the same situation again, I would make the same decision. My primary loyalty is to the safety and well-being of the children in my protection. David's expression suggested that he both admired and was concerned by James's unwavering position.
That kind of certainty is admirable, James, but it may not be enough to save your career. This incident is going to be investigated at the highest levels, and there are going to be people who view your actions as a fundamental breach of the trust and respect that members of the royal family must be able to expect from their protection officers.
Sir, may I ask what the Queen Consort's specific complaints are? James asked. David consulted his notes.
She alleges that you physically assaulted her, that you deliberately undermined her authority in front of Prince Louis, and that you violated your oath and training by interfering in private family matters. She's demanding your immediate dismissal and is considering whether to file formal charges for assault. The mention of formal charges sent a chill through James, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. Sir, I touched her wrist to guide it away from Prince Louis.
I used no more force than would be required to shake hands with someone.
If that constitutes assault, then I suppose I'm guilty, but I would argue that the circumstances justified even that minimal physical contact. The problem, James, is that circumstances don't change the law or the protocol. The Queen Consort has the right to expect that she will not be physically restrained by security personnel except in cases of immediate danger to life and limb.
David paused, then continued in a more personal tone. Off the record, James, what's your gut feeling about what was really happening in here this morning? James considered the question carefully.
Sir, my gut feeling is that the Queen Consort was trying to force a child to take some kind of traditional remedy that may have been inappropriate for his age or condition, using physical force to overcome his natural resistance. I believe she meant well, but I think her methods were causing more harm than good.
And you felt that justified breaching protocol?
Sir, if I had stood by and watched a child being forced to consume an unknown substance while in obvious distress, I don't think I could have looked at myself in the mirror afterwards. Some things are more important than protocol. David was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the competing factors in this unprecedented situation. Finally, he looked up at James with an expression that was both sympathetic and grave.
James, I'm going to be honest with you.
This investigation is going to be thorough, and it's going to be conducted by people who may not share your perspective on the importance of protecting children from family members who mean well but might be using questionable methods. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where gardeners were going about their normal morning routines, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding inside. However, he continued, I also want you to know that your record as a protection officer has been exemplary, and your dedication to the safety of the royal family has never been questioned.
That will count for something in the investigation.
James felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety.
What happens next, sir?
You're being suspended with pay pending a full investigation. You'll need to surrender your security credentials and weapons, and you're not to have any contact with members of the royal family until this is resolved. The words hit James harder than he had expected, even though he had known they were coming. Being cut off from the family he had sworn to protect felt like a punishment that went beyond mere job consequences.
How long will the investigation take, sir?
Could be days, could be weeks. It depends on how many people they interview and whether they can reach any kind of consensus about what actually happened and whether your actions were justified. David turned back from the window and looked at James with genuine concern. James, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that your side of the story is heard and taken seriously. But I also want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this could be the end of your career in royal protection. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of more officials. Two men in dark suits appeared in the doorway, representatives from the investigation team that had apparently been assembled with remarkable speed to deal with the situation.
Inspector Thompson? Sergeant Mitchell?
The older of the two men stepped forward.
I'm Chief Inspector Williams from Professional Standards. We need to begin the formal investigation into this morning's incident immediately.
James felt his stomach drop as he realized that the informal conversation with David had been just the beginning of what was likely to be a long and difficult process. The morning that had started with such simple concerns about a child's cold had transformed into something that could destroy his career and potentially land him in legal trouble. As he prepared to surrender his credentials and begin what might be his final day as a member of the Royal Protection Team, James found himself thinking not about his own future, but about Louis's frightened face and the relief in the child's eyes when he had finally been freed from Camilla's grip. Whatever happened to him personally, James knew that he had made the right choice in that moment. Some things were indeed more important than protocol, and the safety and well-being of children would always be at the top of that list. Chief Inspector Williams was a tall, lean man in his early 50s with the kind of precise demeanor that came from decades of investigating sensitive cases within government and royal circles. His gray eyes missed nothing as they swept the breakfast room, taking in the dark stain on the marble floor, the overturned spoon, and the tension that still hung in the air like an almost visible presence. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said in a voice that was neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional, "before we begin the formal interview process, I need you to understand that this investigation will be thorough and impartial. You have the right to have a representative present during questioning, and anything you say may be used in both disciplinary proceedings and potential criminal charges." The mention of criminal charges sent another chill through James, but he maintained his military bearing. "I understand, sir. I waive my right to representation for now, and I'm prepared to answer your questions truthfully and completely." Williams nodded and gestured to his colleague, a younger man with dark hair and an iPad who immediately began taking notes. "This is Inspector Davies. He'll be recording our conversation and gathering evidence." "Before we discuss the events of this morning, I want to establish some background information about your role and experience here." For the next 20 minutes, Williams methodically walked through James's service record, his training, his previous assignments, and his specific duties within the Royal Protection Detail. James answered each question precisely, aware that every detail might be scrutinized for relevance to the morning's events. "Now," Williams said, settling back in his chair, "I want you to walk me through everything that happened this morning, from the moment you first became aware of any situation involving Prince Louis and the Queen Consort. Take your time, and be as specific as possible about times, locations, and exact words that were spoken." James took a deep breath and began his account, starting with his routine morning security check and the sound of crying that had first alerted him to a problem. He described every detail he could remember: the smell of the medicine, the color and consistency of the liquid, the exact way Camilla had been gripping Louis's chin, the child's specific words of protest. Williams interrupted frequently with clarifying questions that revealed the thoroughness of his investigative training. "You mentioned that Prince Louis said, 'I don't want to take it.' Can you recall his exact tone of voice? Was this the whining tone of a child avoiding medicine, or something more urgent?" "It was definitely more urgent, sir," James replied. "It wasn't whining or ordinary resistance. His voice had a quality of real fear and distress. He sounded genuinely panicked, not just stubborn. And, when you first intervened verbally, what was the Queen Consort's exact response?" James closed his eyes briefly, trying to recall the precise words. "She told me that this was a family matter and that I was overstepping my bounds. She said that she was perfectly capable of caring for the child and didn't need input from security staff." Davies looked up from his iPad. "Did she explain what the medicine was or why she felt it was necessary for Prince Louis to take it immediately?" "She mentioned that it was a traditional family remedy that had been used for generations. She said it was more effective than modern medicines and that her grandmother had used it, her mother had used it, and she had used it on King Charles during his illnesses." Williams made a note on his pad. "Did she provide any specifics about what the remedy was supposed to treat or what it contained?" "No, sir. She just said it would help Prince Louis feel better and that bitter-tasting medicines were often the most effective." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, with Williams probing every aspect of the incident from multiple angles. James found himself describing not just what had happened, but also his thought process at each stage and the specific factors that had influenced his decision-making. "Sergeant Mitchell," Williams said finally, "I want to address the critical moment when you made physical contact with the Queen Consort. Walk me through your exact actions and the reasoning behind them." James straightened in his chair, knowing that this was the heart of the matter. "Sir, I observed that Prince Louis's distress was escalating and that the Queen Consort was becoming more forceful in her attempts to make him swallow the medicine.
She had pressed the spoon against his lips hard enough that some of the liquid had spilled onto his face and pajamas, and he appeared to be gagging from the smell. At what point did you decide that physical intervention was necessary?
When I saw that she was prepared to use force to pry his mouth open despite his obvious terror and physical revulsion. In my judgment, the situation had moved beyond normal medical administration and into something that could be harmful to the child's well-being. Williams leaned forward slightly. Describe your physical contact with the Queen Consort in detail. I placed my hand on her wrist, the one holding the spoon, and applied gentle but firm pressure to guide it away from Prince Louis's mouth. I used no more force than would be required for a polite handshake. My intention was to stop the immediate action, not to cause any discomfort or harm to the Queen Consort.
How long did this physical contact last?
No more than a few seconds, sir. As soon as she released her grip on Prince Louis's chin and stepped back, I removed my hand from her wrist.
Davies looked up from his notes. What was Prince Louis's immediate reaction when the physical restraint was removed?
He slumped back in his chair with obvious relief. His crying decreased immediately, and, while he was still upset, the panic seemed to leave him once he realized he wasn't going to be forced to take the medicine.
Williams consulted his notes for several minutes before continuing. Sergeant Mitchell, I've read the Queen Consort's formal complaint about this incident.
She alleges that you used unnecessary force, that you deliberately humiliated her in front of Prince Louis, and that you showed complete disregard for her position and authority.
How do you respond to these allegations?
James had been expecting this question and had thought carefully about his response. Sir, I regret that the Queen Consort felt humiliated or disrespected.
That was never my intention.
My only goal was to protect Prince Louis from what I perceived as a threat to his well-being. As for unnecessary force, I maintain that I used the absolute minimum physical contact necessary to achieve that goal.
But, you acknowledge that you had no authority to physically restrain a senior member of the royal family?
Sir, my oath is to protect the royal family from all threats to their safety and well-being.
In extraordinary circumstances, that might require extraordinary actions.
I believe that oath gave me not just the authority but the obligation to act when I saw a child in distress. Williams set down his pen and looked directly at James.
Sergeant Mitchell, are you suggesting that the Queen Consort posed a threat to Prince Louis?
It was a loaded question, and James knew that his answer could determine whether this incident was viewed as a protection officer doing his duty or as an act of insubordination against the monarchy itself. Sir, I'm suggesting that the situation I observed, regardless of who was involved, represented a potential threat to a child's well-being. My response would have been the same whether the person forcing unwanted medicine on Prince Louis was a family member, a staff member, or a complete stranger. The answer seemed to satisfy Williams, who made another note before continuing. We're going to need to examine this medicine that was spilled.
Do you know if any of the liquid remains for analysis?
Inspector Thompson ordered the spill to be preserved and photographed before cleaning, sir.
He mentioned wanting to have it analyzed. Good.
Williams turned to Davies. Make sure the forensics team gets samples of that stain and analyzes it for content and potential safety concerns, especially regarding pediatric use. The mention of forensic analysis made the situation feel even more serious to James. What had started as a family dispute over medicine was now being treated like a potential case of child endangerment, with scientific evidence being gathered and analyzed. Sergeant Mitchell, Williams continued, we're also going to need to interview other witnesses to this incident.
I understand that Maria Gonzalez, Prince Louis's nanny, arrived during or immediately after the confrontation?
Yes, sir. She arrived just after I had intervened and was able to observe the aftermath of the situation. She also spoke with Prince Louis and assessed his condition. And Prince Louis himself will need to be interviewed, though we'll handle that very carefully given his age and the sensitive nature of the situation.
James felt a surge of concern about involving Louis more deeply in the investigation. Sir, will Prince Louis understand what's happening?
He's only 5 years old, and he was already quite upset this morning. We have specialists who are trained in interviewing young children in sensitive situations, Williams assured him. The interview will be conducted in a comfortable environment with Maria present, and we'll be very careful not to cause him additional distress.
Davies looked up from his iPad.
Inspector Williams, we should also consider interviewing Dr. Harrison about appropriate medical treatments for Prince Louis's condition and whether the remedy described by Sergeant Mitchell would be considered safe for a child.
Agreed.
And we'll need to speak with King Charles about his wife's traditional medicine practices and whether he was aware of her intention to treat Prince Louis with this particular remedy. The mention of King Charles made James realize for the first time how high up the royal hierarchy this investigation was likely to reach. What had begun as a confrontation between him and Camilla was now going to involve the king himself, and potentially other senior members of the royal family.
Sir, James said carefully, may I ask about the timeline for this investigation? I understand that I'm suspended pending the outcome, but I'm concerned about the impact on security coverage for the royal children. Williams's expression softened slightly.
Your concern for security coverage is noted and appreciated, Sergeant Mitchell. Inspector Thompson is already arranging for temporary coverage of your duties.
As for timeline, these matters are never resolved quickly.
We're looking at weeks rather than days, especially if this case generates media attention or if criminal charges are filed. The mention of media attention sent another chill through James. He hadn't considered the possibility that the incident might become public knowledge, with all the scrutiny and controversy that would bring.
Will this become public, sir?
We're doing everything possible to keep the investigation confidential, Williams replied.